I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss a heap of topics pertaining to modern music, including artists, deep dives, and monthly new music wrap-ups. There are few rock bands in existence today that I would say qualify for consideration of best rock act of our time. I believe Coheed and Cambria should be on that list, but I'm not sure what my friend Tom here thought what his thoughts on the matter are. Today,
I'm holding all the cards, Jake.
You better. It's a house of cards. Today, Tom and I are going to take a look at Coheed and Cambria's extensive discography. And we're going to attempt to identify what makes this band so darn likable and what could potentially qualify or disqualify them from the label Best Rock Act of our age.
All right.
But before we get started, you can help support Velocities in Music. Subscribe to Velocities in Music on your favorite podcasting device to automatically get our latest podcast episodes sent to your device each week. Also, Velocities in Music doesn't want your money. We also don't want to introduce ads to this podcast just yet. Right now, all we want is for you to share Velocities in Music with family or friends whom you think would benefit from joining in on the music discussion we are trying to create every week here on this podcast. So, Tom.
Yes.
Last weekend, you and I got to spend the weekend together.
We did.
We took a long drive up to Minneapolis, actually St. Paul, Minnesota, and we got to see one hell of a concert.
Yeah, it was a great show.
Who played?
It was Glassjaw and Coheed and Cambria.
Now,
Great
we've seen
lineup.
Glassjaw before together.
We had, yes.
And you've seen Coheed a couple of times,
Yeah,
right?
a couple times. Once in very early 2009 when they were opening for Slipknot. I saw them. And then I saw headlining show of theirs in February 2013 when they were touring for the Afterman albums.
Nice. I bet that was an awesome show, too.
It was, yep.
Yeah. So this was my first exposure to Coheed.
Yeah.
Live. And these guys are known for having just a stupendous live show. And this tour, they're actually headlining, right? So,
yeah.
So we got an extended set of Coheed material. And so I just want to say I thought that they put on a great performance.
They really did.
And while their new album, which we covered briefly last year when it came out in our October monthly wrap-up, while it probably wasn't my favorite at the time, seeing them perform those songs live, just a spoiler alert once we get to it in this deep dive, it certainly has warmed me up to that album.
Yeah. They played 7 of the 10 tracks from the new album at the concert.
They covered it pretty extensively.
And I thought that they all sounded great. They weaved them into the set with the rest of their older material really well.
Right. And in addition to this, Tom, I think... the reason why my voice sounds so crappy is because I got deathly ill this week because I think Tom gave me his plague that he suffered from last week.
It might be my fault.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. So I apologize again for my voice this week as I struggle through.
You're just extra low and sultry.
It's
low. Good. It's good.
Sweet and low.
Yes.
So Tom, how would you classify Coheed and Cambria's sound?
That is a good question, and it's probably the good place to start because honestly, it's one of the things that I think makes this band so unique and is what makes them stand out as a band in our time in the 2000s. Because when you listen to their earlier work, it's really more along the lines of. I don't want to say pop punk, but there's an element of that along with some emo and post-hardcore. Like that's what it feels more like to me. But then by the time you get to their second album, and I know I'm giving a little bit of a preview on what we'll be dissecting more album by album specifically shortly to come, but as an overview, I think it's important to talk about style, and you can't talk about the style of Coheed without addressing the general timeline of the band, because after their first album, just as soon as their second album, they were getting much more progressive. You hear a lot of progressive rock elements, and those worlds kind of clash in a way that I think makes this band very singular. Right. I don't really hear any other rock bands combining so unabashedly elements of emo and post-hardcore with progressive rock and progressive metal. I mean, there are definitely some metal moments, but what I like is that you can't really call them a metal band, but you can't really call them an emo or a post-hardcore band. I don't really know what to call them other than just rock, because they infuse so many different subgenres across their discography.
Yeah, they cover they can do everything, and everything that they do so well.
Right.
That the only thing that you can't actually question is the fact that when you listen to a Coheed and Cambria album, they are going to rock your face off.
Yeah. And I think the thread that holds that together, no matter what production style they're going for, no matter what songwriting and presentation kind of genre they're going for, what it comes down to is that every single thing that they do just carries that natural knack for melody that Claudio Sanchez has as the lead vocalist, as the guitarist and primary songwriter. He has just such a recognizable approach to melodic construction and chord structure that's what defines the whole band.
He's also an extremely accomplished musician.
Yeah.
Watching him play guitar last weekend was mind-blowing. There was a time where I actually turned around to Tom. Tom's, a head taller than me, so I always stand in front of him. So there was actually a time in the concert where I turned around to Tom and my jaw was dropped because I could not understand how it's possible for Sanchez to play what he was playing on guitar and singing a relatively complex vocal melody on top of this extremely complex guitar melody that he was just riffing out. And I couldn't even fathom how one could do that. Like that level of talent is just absurd to me. In addition to being just a wonderful songwriter and a brilliant instrumentalist, I think songwriting doesn't exactly do Claudio Sanchez justice because he's really a visionary. With the exception of their latest release, every Coheed album exists within the confines of another universe that Claudio Sanchez created. And their first 5 albums all take place in the same storyline. Yeah. And imagine the scope of that now, and all of the graphic novels that have come with these albums, all of the comics, the storylines that have been written in there. Just the first album alone had such a complex story that it's not really possible for us to do it justice summarizing it here. But the fact that he is able to create this level of music that is also backed by such an extensive storyline. No other artist out there is doing this right now. Right. Not to this extent.
No, and I think that it's really kind of an anomaly that they're as popular as they are. I mean, they're not anymore one of what I would call like a mainstream rock band, but in the mid 2000s, around 2005, 2006 was probably the peak of their like radio popularity.
Right after Welcome Home was issued.
Right, exactly. Right. And that was, they had some big singles around that time and gained some momentum, and they're still out there and have a loyal fan base. But it's an anomaly to me that they were able to achieve that kind of success, because this is some of the headiest stuff you'll ever listen to. I mean, this is a concept band. Right. They don't just make concept records or albums. I mean, it's the entire scope of their career has been around this concept. And it is, you know me, Jake, I'm a sci-fi fan. Right. I like crazy sci-fi stuff. And this is even out there for me. Oh, yeah. The storyline of the Amory Wars, all the characters, all of the things going on. I can barely even keep up with it. Now, given I haven't really tried to dive into the comics, and I'm sure that's what would be necessary to fully wrap your head around it. For sure. But what's interesting is they let it influence the music in such a way that you would think it'd be inaccessible to the average listener. So here's this band who has these really lofty musical ideas with lofty conceptual themes, and yet somehow they're able to break into the pop and rock mainstream. And I think it's all thanks to Claudio's unique voice and his ability to hammer out memorable hooks in rock.
So before we dive into the music and address the story, I think we should talk a little bit about band history. Where do these guys come from? How did they come to be Coheed and Cambria?
So the history of Coheed and Cambria goes back to the mid-90s, around 1995, when Claudio Sanchez and Travis Stevers started a band. They were in several other bands with kind of rotating lineups before they really settled on Coheed and Cambria and had a more formalized lineup a few years later, kind of in the late 90s there. And that's really, about all there is to it. I mean, it's a pretty classic story. In a lot of bands, just you have your kind of core members that go through several other bands before settling on something that really just kind of feels right, and they took it from there.
And Tom, one thing that you said earlier is, how does this band that makes such complex music, from just the instrumentation to the actual song structures to the concept that drives their music. How did they become popular? How did they become mainstream to at least a point, to at least be recognized and grow and actually pack houses and things like that when they played shows? And one thing that in reading up on Coheed and Cambria's history that struck me as interesting is in about August 2002, they started working with a manager who became their band manager. His name is Blaze James. And the reason why this guy is significant to Coheed's story is, for one thing, he has a sweet name. Blaze James is just a badass name. But if you think back to when we did our Beatles deep dive, can you imagine the Beatles without Brian Epstein?
No.
You have these insanely talented musicians, and they're constantly focused on their art, focused on their instrumentation, focused on improving their craft, right? Coheed is very much the same way, just totally different styles, totally different derivation of music. And they hook up with this manager who proved to be very good because he had worked with other acts in the past. He got them doing shows with Linkin Park, The Used, Slipknot, and these exposures really got them in front of people who had a natural aptitude for the sort of musical brand that Coheed was selling, that intense yet heady, just thought that goes into their music. And honestly, it's something like if you look at like Linkin Park, for instance, like Linkin Park is all about melody and intensity, but their music always lacks something, and it lacked a maturity that Coheed naturally has, because their music tells a story. It tells a very complex story, sci-fi story, but it also tells a very human story. And it's something that I think relates to everybody. And I think that is so powerful. The fact that they got the right manager at the right time in their career really helped set them apart. And it's something that I think so few bands actually are able to capitalize on their potential, because they don't have someone that's pushing them forward. They're forced to do this on their own, and they don't have someone that's pushing them forward. So that they end up trying to do some of the business on their side to get them started, and then they don't focus on their craft as much. So I just feel like this is such a significant thing, because it got them in the right place at the right time in front of the right audiences that gave them that next step and allowed them to continue building these albums that just built on top of one another. It was honestly like it's a pretty genius, almost accidental recipe for success.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you don't have someone to manage that business side of things, I think if the artist gets too involved in that, it can really kill it for them, and it can actually really truncate a lot of the creativity that's necessary to go into that process.
So, Tom, 14 years ago yesterday,
whoa,
Coheed and Cambria's first album, The Second Stage Turbine Blade, was released.
Yeah.
The Second Stage Turbine Blade, that's a very interesting title. Why would they choose that title?
Well, it actually represents the second installment of the Amory Wars series. So they're starting kind of, not in the middle, but they're skipping a step there in the storyline, which I actually think is really neat, because right from their first release, they kind of show you that they're still holding some cards up their sleeves. They're not playing all their tricks right away. There's still more story to come back to, which we'll get a little bit later. But that's where the story begins musically for them, is with this album.
Right. And in trying to understand the story of the Amory Wars and Coheed and Cambria, first of all, the band's name is taken from the two main characters in the Second Stage Turbine Blade, Coheed and Cambria. And there's a whole, there was a 2-volume of comics built around this album. And so the album songs kind of highlight the main events of that storyline. And I just want to come out and say, there's no way Tom and I can do the storyline justice for a couple of reasons. One is that each album represents a different time frame in the story. And while the story is often compared to the likes of Star Wars, just like in Star Wars, each movie takes place over a different period of time. Each album in Coheed and Cambria's discography takes place over a different time in the Amory Wars. So it's almost impossible for us to do this story justice because there's either too much content, like in the case of the Second Stage Turbine Blade, where there's 2 volumes of a comic that you would have to go through to get the full detailed story. So way too much detail. And then online, there's just not that much available for their second album, In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth. Their third album, Good Apollo on Burning Star 4 From Fear Through the Eyes of Madness, you have a graphic novel that goes with it. But then their fourth album, Good Apollo on Burning Star 4, No World for Tomorrow,
Yep.
there is absolutely nothing written about. So it makes it very difficult to go into detail about what the story is, because you're either depending on what time frame you're talking about, you're either going to have too much detail to summarize effectively,
right,
or not enough content to provide an accurate story.
Well, and it's not like everything is covered evenly between the stories themselves, the comics, and the music.
Yeah.
The comics inspire the music, and I'm sure that Claudio Sanchez takes that content and it inspires what he writes, but at the same time, there's going to be parts of the comics that aren't represented here, and parts in the music that might over-represent what happens in the comics. So, the two run in parallel, but I don't think that means that they're necessarily proportional in how they're telling the story. But of course, it's still a necessary element because it does influence the content, and the content influences the style of the music and the mood of the music, and we see that throughout their timeline.
All right, Tom. So to dive into Coheed and Cambria's first album, the Second Stage Turbine Blade, you gotta attempt to summarize the story at a high level. I'm going to go ahead and give it a shot.
Go for it.
Wish me the best of luck. I'm going to try to keep it as high level as possible. Okay. Coheed and Cambria, 2 characters, and they're like the main characters of the story of the first Coheed record that was released. And these 2 are these like superhuman, half like people, half machines called iRobots. And by the way, I might totally butcher this, so just go with me here. Go with me for a minute. They are in some sort of like long elongated battle or war with this really bad guy who's essentially Darth Vader, Supreme Tri-Mage Wilhelm Ryan. And essentially what happens is the Coheed and Cambria become convinced that they have like some evil virus called the Monstar virus stored inside them, and Ryan is able to convince Coheed and Cambria that actually their children, I think he convinces them that their children have the virus, and that in order to save the galaxy that they live in, which is often called Heaven's Fence or something like that, they have to kill their children. They have 4 children. They killed the youngest 2, Matthew and Mia, and then Josephine, she dies somewhere along the way, and the only child to survive is Claudio. But in the event that, as the story plays out, a whole bunch of stuff happens. There's these different races that occur within this galaxy, and essentially what happens is the story just goes to shit. It's a tragedy, and they start like developing these like second level powers that are pretty crazy, and Cambria ends up killing Coheed and then uses the last of her energy to kill herself, and there's the whole story that goes on underneath that. So essentially this it sounds a lot like Romeo and Juliet, so because this first album is essentially built to be a tragedy, but the importance of the story is that it sets up the following 3 records, which we'll get to in a little bit. So with that terrible summary of a 2-part volume comic, you get kind of the framework for what is a Second Stage Turbine Blade, which is essentially a very long progressive post-hardcore album.
Yeah. Now,
Tom, one thing you mentioned earlier when we were just starting to describe Coheed's sound was that they certainly flirt with pop punk.
Yeah.
And that's very key, because I'd say especially in their first 2 records, so Second Stage Turbine Blade coming out in 2002, that was right when pop punk music was at a height, at least in the United States. Bands that come to mind in the early 2000s, and it was emo and pop punk that were both really big. Bands like Newfound Glory or Dashboard Confessionals. I'm sure you can think of some others off the top of your head that both you and I listened to a ton back when we were very young, angsty teenagers, right? And so Coheed's kind of hitting in that genre. But like I said earlier, in comparison to like Linkin Park, they're offering something totally different.
Right.
And what would be something different that you think Coheed offers?
So here, this is going to be a little bit of a long-winded response to that question, Jake. But there's something I want to get out there. This is a concept that this is how I think of music most of the time. I don't know if this will make sense to other people, so I'll kind of explain this system. But I think of it in terms of the horizontal versus the vertical. And I think I've mentioned this before, but what I mean when I say vertical is like at any one instance of the music, if you take a 10-second clip and you're not taking time into account, but you're just hearing what their instrumental palette and style is in that instant, then you can describe a band's sound based on that. What I think of as the kind of the horizontal aspect is the temporal aspect. How do songs flow over time? How does an album flow over time? What sections of the songs, verses, choruses, bridges, endings, interludes, things like that, how do those play into the song structure?
Right.
What's interesting about Second Stage Turbine Blade is if you look at the vertical aspect, if you take 10 seconds of any song, you're going to hear some pop punk, emo, and post-hardcore elements. But what they're doing with that horizontal, that temporal aspect of it, is they're making these long, flowing, expansive songs that really harken more to progressive rock than anything. And it's taking a style, a sound, and putting it into a song format that you really didn't hear much back then. And that's really what defines them to me and defines the Second Stage Turbine Blade in general, because if you look at these track lengths, on average, they're like 5 minutes long, at least, usually 4.5 to 5.5 minutes long. That is not something you get from pop music. It's not something you get from punk music, and it's not something you get from pop punk music.
Right.
You didn't really see Blink-182 coming out with songs that were 5.5 minutes long on average. And that is what Coheed and Cambria were doing. You see that all over this album, especially after the first track, which is just kind of the title track, intro track, where they establish this kind of motif of a melody that will come back throughout their discography. The next 3 tracks, Time Consumer, Devil in Jersey City, and Everything Evil, which are 3 of my favorite Coheed tracks right in a row. One thing that they all have in common is they establish this kind of verse and chorus dichotomy and a structure in that regard that are extremely catchy. And then they just shift in the middle of the song and go into this outro that really you can hardly call it an outro because it's like the entire second half of each song that just goes, it's a complete left turn that you wouldn't expect.
Right.
What I love about the tracks like this that Coheed does is they essentially establish like 2 or 3 extremely memorable parts of one single song.
Right.
A lot of songs, usually you get 1, maybe you get 2 of. Like that's something that I think Oasis was really good at, was making catchy verses and choruses. But you listen to an Oasis song and usually that's all there was to it, was a verse and a chorus. What Coheed does is they establish great verses, great choruses, and then they just have this whole other just like screw it part of the song where
instrumental
they just
sprawl.
Right,
I wouldn't call it a jam because it's so much more technical and thought out than a jam. A jam is usually much more fluid, but more based in improvisation too. This is extremely technically complex. I mean, the guitars on this record are working their ass off the entire time. And the great thing about this is that you have multiple layers of rhythm going on. You have a rhythm guitar. Oftentimes the lead guitar is providing rhythmic riffing and stuff like that. But there's always going to be guitar melodies that help seal the deal. Now, Claudio Sanchez's vocals, we haven't talked about that yet. The thing that you if you've never been exposed to Coheed's music before, one of the first things you're going to think is, man, this guy sings really, really high. The only other artist that comes to mind when I think about actually has a sound similar to this is the Mars Volta. And again, came out, I think Mars Volta's first record came out in 2003, so these guys would have actually preceded them by a year. But in the same time, they're actually very similar in that they're adding this extra layer to a very popular but overdone style of music at the time.
And I know Coheed was influenced by At the Drive-In, so that kind of makes
perfect
sense.
Yeah. And so you have these very high vocals, but Sanchez's vocals are extremely melodic, and because he has such a high voice, anything that he does sticks out in the mix.
Yeah,
and it sounds so it complements the instrumentation so well, because in all honesty the production on the Second Stage Turbine Blade is absolute crap.
Yeah.
It is totally underproduced.
Yeah.
It's the guitars sound nasally.
Yes.
They like even and I'm listening to like the remastered version. Like the guitars sound nasally. The drums just sound just flat.
Yeah.
And,
the drums, they're tight, but they're not big sounding.
Yeah.
They're very thin.
Right. And you know that's gonna come to change as Coheed gets more popular. They sign a major record label deal, and they get more money to really do the full production. But that's what's beautiful about the Second Stage Turbine Blade. This album succeeds at every level. It has an advanced concept, has wonderful songwriting, wonderful instrumentation. It's incredibly original, and tons of melody, tons of comeback quality. And it does so in almost just like spitting in the face of the fact that they didn't have enough money to produce it correctly.
Right, because it didn't matter.
It didn't matter.
They made that what would technically and probably traditionally be considered like a downside to the album, they make it work for them.
Right.
Because it actually contributes to the more endearing qualities of the album, which I think is encapsulated by Claudio Sanchez's vocals. You know, like you said, the kind of high presentation, which has a tendency to be anything from twee to dramatic to aggressive. Somehow he brings you in such a way that you're on board with it no matter what. And I think that the lack of production of this album actually works with that aspect of the music and the songwriting.
Right. In moving on, 2003, Coheed returns with their second album titled In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3. Now, believe it or not, Tom, Second Stage Turbine Blade is only 48.5 minutes long.
Yes.
In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth is significantly longer. It's 20 minutes longer. This thing is 69 minutes long.
Yeah.
Which, this is an incredibly long album. And what I will say is that makes it slightly more inaccessible. And I'm going to come out and say something here. And Tom, this is not going to surprise you at all. In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3 is my favorite Coheed album. And the reason is because every single track on this record, it is, to me, Second Stage Turbine Blade and In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3 are very similar to the evolution that you see between Led Zeppelin's first album, 1, and Led Zeppelin's second album, 2. You see an evolution in their songs. Even though Second Stage Turbine Blade, we just spent, 5-10 minutes talking about how incredibly well done it is, In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3 perfects everything that we just heard. Yeah. Any of the rough edges were perfected. The production is just a notch better on this record.
A little bit.
It's
not too much. But,
but their songwriting, the story, so taking a step back and thinking about how the story changes in this album, honestly, not a lot happens in the story, and there isn't much more than what Wikipedia provides to dig into the story, unless there's something out there. And I'm going to be the first person to admit that while I have a lot of interest in this story, I only have the desire to pursue it just enough so that it enhances the music for me. Which is the cool thing about Coheed and Cambria is that you can do that. You can go as deep as you want. With a certain limitation, but you can go very deep into the storyline, and depending on how much you want it to influence how you interpret the music, because I've honestly gotten the craving to like sit down and go through every track and like read through the lyrics and like try to tie it out to the story and figure out how that works. If I wanted to go that deep, I could. I haven't gotten there yet. I just want to have a vague awareness of what happens in the story, the characters involved, and what the general plot line is, because I think that really enhances the lyrics that I'm hearing Sanchez sing out and belt out on every one of these songs. And I think that especially in Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3, there's a number of lyrics, and this is where I really think Sanchez has evolved between the first album and the second album, where he evolves as a vocalist and a songwriter. I think his lyrics are significantly better on the second album, and specifically his vocal hooks are much more catchy.
Yeah,
and that is, to me, the single significant difference between the Second Stage Turbine Blade and In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3, aside from just album length.
And so I'm actually gonna contrast your opinion just a little bit here,
buddy.
Because my favorite album of theirs is Second Stage Turbine Blade. So in their first two albums, we've already covered each of our number one picks for favorite Coheed album, and I think the reason I lean towards that one a little bit more than this one, and I really like this album still, I would consider it probably to be my third favorite album of theirs. So we'll get to my number two in a little bit. But the reason that Second Stage Turbine Blade sticks out a little more to me is because I like what they accomplished. Like, each track is a little bit more memorable to me. Here, they really bring in the prog elements, right? Especially when you get to the two ending tracks, The Light in the Glass and 2113, both of which are over 9 minutes long. You end with two tracks that cover almost a total 20 minutes of the album.
If you separate those last two tracks, The Light in the Glass and 2113, the album is almost exactly the same length as the Second Stage Turbine Blade.
Right,
So it's
they just added that on in the end.
Yeah, they added two like epic prog songs onto the end of it.
And I also have to point out, so these guys claim that they're not influenced by Rush.
Oh, that's such crap.
but they sound so much like them, and they have a goddamn song called 2113. Like, come on. Come on. 2112, Rush? Like, have you come on. Like,
Tom's pointing to his 2112 poster.
I am. Yeah, no one can see it, but I totally was.
So in the next album, they even show their Rush influence as is even more undeniable in the Willing Well, on the tracks at the end of their third album. But getting back to In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3, the one thing that I absolutely love about this album is that it really flows well as a cohesive listen.
Yeah, much more than Second Stage Turbine Blade. Yes. I will totally agree with you
and
there.
Knowing the difference between like what you're really looking for in a great album, what I am looking for in a great album, this totally...
It makes sense.
It totally
I'm more about highlight tracks. You're more about cohesive album listening.
This checks all my boxes, right?
Yep.
So this evolution of the story. So... the tragedy of the Second Stage Turbine Blade and the events that happen in that, Coheed and Cambria are dead. Their son, their last living offspring, whom was I guess out or away at the time that they decided to kill their children, is still alive, and he is, now it's like 10 years has passed. So he's past this like angsty teenager phase, and now he's into this hardened adult phase where he's actually becoming like a real man. He's becoming a man, right? Deep voice. And he's starting to want to seek revenge for his parents' death, and obviously like this Darth Vader character, Mayo Dettenwolf or whatever his name is. I'm sorry, Wilhelm Ryan and his General Mayo Dettenwolf, whatever. Captain Hook and Smee. So he has taken the mantle that he has to figure out why they were killed, and he's starting to want revenge, and this is gonna play out over the course of the album. And a whole bunch of other small subplots happen, but essentially you're building this character who's going to become the hero of the next records, and really the hero of the Amory War story. So you have a lot of where the first album was like this huge epic tragedy. This album is much more, it's much more of a tale of becoming something. And to me, that is always, that style of story has always spoken a lot to me, right? So the album starts off with the song "The Ring and Return," which brings that familiar melody of Coheed and Cambria of the Amory War story back into play. And then the album kicks into the title track, In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3, which is an 8-minute epic track. And this song is telling the story of this battle that's happening to one of the characters in the Coheed and Cambria storyline. And it's very interesting because the chorus of this, and this is the reason why I bring this up, is because it makes the point of how Claudio Sanchez has evolved as a vocal and lyrical writer because the chorus of man your battle stations and man your own jackhammer, and just how, like, in seeing this song perform live, which we did, it was the second song that they played. The whole crowd just erupted during the choruses of this song. And this song, like, well, I say there's choruses, but like this is an 8-minute long song.
Right.
It's more of like these movements come to a point where there are a chorus occasionally, right? And just seeing the crowd erupt, it was living proof of the fact that Sanchez had written just this genius melody.
Yeah.
That just demanded to be screamed out at the top of everyone's lungs.
And there's nothing on Second Stage Turbine Blade that is quite as unifying as that. And I think what's also neat about this album is this is where they really started to break through into the mainstream with Favor House Atlantic, which was their first really big, groundbreaking single for them. They also, Blood Red Summer was made a single later on to kind of follow the success of Favor House Atlantic. But I think it's so funny because that is easily the poppiest song in their entire catalog.
Oh, both of those tracks are two of the poppiest tracks.
And I think back, so I didn't actually, I liked that song when it came out, but I actually didn't really start listening to Coheed more heavily until probably like 2006, somewhere in there. And when this album came out, 2003, I was in like 8th or 9th grade, and I heard the song and I liked it, but I just think of all the people who might have followed other kind of like pop rock, pop punk bands, and then went out and bought this CD after hearing Favor House Atlantic, put it on, hear the 2-minute kind of melodic instrumental intro, and then listen to this 8-minute epic progressive rock metal track.
And they either loved it or they hated it. Right. It had to be a very polarizing experience.
Definitely, because it's not, who would have expected something like this at the time? And it was actually kind of a misleading single. But what I like about that too is still Favor House Atlantic, as much as it's kind of their like, stereotypical trademark track, it's one of my favorites still. I love it. I actually really like the poppier side of Coheed because I think they find a way to make it work.
They're able to make a pop sounding track. A track loaded with like pop hooks, so just like a very upbeat, optimistic sounding guitar part and vocal parts that whoa
they've got the whoa-oh-ohs all over the place.
It's a generic pop songwriting trick, but they make it work.
Yeah, they do.
The other thing is that they don't sacrifice on intensity, even in the pop tracks. They make the intensity cute, but it still fits the song. Like if you listen to Blood Red Summer, the guitars on Blood Red Summer explode towards the middle and end of the song and provide some of the best melody that you're going to hear on the record.
Yep.
So it just shows how great these guys are at writing just incredibly well-written and catchy guitar hooks that also add a lot of intensity and stick within the same sonic motif that they're establishing on the record.
And expanding their sound on this album, compare it to Second Stage Turbine Blade, what they're doing is they're exploring both extremes of their sound.
Right.
The poppy stuff on here is far poppier than anything that you got on Second Stage Turbine Blade. The metal parts and the prog parts are way more progressive and heavier than the stuff you heard on Second Stage Turbine Blade. When you get to the crowing, those drum and guitar riffs near the end, oh my God.
Yeah.
You never heard anything like that on their previous record, and it's something that they'll do even more on subsequent albums, but they're just getting so much more expansive with their sound, even more expansive with their song structures, where you get these huge prog epic tracks, and still they're maintaining that quality.
Not only do they have longer track lengths on this album, like the title track, but tracks 7 through 9 on In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth centered around this ship that the lead character Claudio Kilgannon.
Yep.
That's how you say it. Apparently, I've been reading it wrong in my head all these years. Great. Nice job, Jake. Anyway, so he finds this ship that becomes his ship, and so it's called the Camper. This is how I'm pronouncing it in my head. Valorium.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
And so it's really 15 minutes in a row. Each track averages to be around 5 minutes long, but it's a 3-part epic, right? And really, if you're not paying attention to the lyrics and the tracks. In the tracks themselves, it just flows perfectly throughout the rest of the album. So you might not even notice that you're in this 15-minute epic. And then it goes to A Favor House Atlantic, which is the poppier track that Tom mentioned. But then you have those two huge prog rock epic tracks of over 9.5 minutes of content with The Light in the Glass, which I think does a wonderful job of summing up the album from a musical perspective and a lyrical perspective at that. That is one of my favorite tracks on the album, and it's one of the reasons why I love this album so much is because you have all this wonderful music, and then at the very end of the album, you get a 9-minute song that completely summarizes the huge epic that you've been on. And then once it finishes, you still have what I would consider to be one of the best outro tracks ever, which is 2113.
Mm-hmm. And they also, in their reference, they jump back to the guitar riff from Time Consumer, the first real track on Second Stage Turbine Blade. So they're still, in tying the music together, are also tying together the conceptual themes of the story.
Which is just genius.
Yeah.
Just genius.
So moving now to September 2005, we have the next album from Coheed and Cambria, which is Good Apollo, I'm Burning Star 4 from Fear Through the Eyes of Madness.
Hold up.
Say that 5 times fast.
Good Apollo, I'm Burning Star 4, Volume 1.
Oh, that's right. I forgot the volume.
Fear.
I knew I'd forget something.
From Fear Through the Eyes of Madness.
Yes.
Now, I think how it's gone down in history is that people just refer to this album, fans just refer to this album as Good Apollo.
Yeah.
And the album that follows this one is Good Apollo, I'm Burning Star 4, Volume 2, No World for Tomorrow. But people just call it No World for Tomorrow. So this one's called Good Apollo, and that one's called No World for Tomorrow.
So let's just move forward with that kind of indication of the album.
Okay,
so
I'm a hipster.
You're a purist.
I'm a wannabe hipster. Like if I had glasses, I'd probably push them up right now and just be like, I'm gonna call it From Fear Through the Eyes of Madness. Because that's its name.
No, go for it. I'll still know what you're talking about, but I'll probably just call it Good Apollo.
Okay.
So this album is where they signed to Columbia Records. The major labels were seeing more potential after the success of their sophomore album, after the success of Favor House Atlantic as a single. And so, wow, do you see their budget go up? And wow, does that come through in the production value?
It makes a huge
Oh my God.
difference.
Like all of a sudden they go from being this kind of underground sounding band to sounding like a polished, progressive rock band made for the radio. And that's kind of how it seems at first, but what I love is that what they had as a single was Welcome Home, track 3 on this album, which follows a couple of what I would kind of call intro tracks.
Absolutely.
Keeping the Blade and Always and Never, which the first is kind of an orchestral piece. Always and Never is still a very real song, but it's a shorter one for Coheed, a little over 2 minutes, and it's more just an acoustic and vocal track. It still sets things up well, but then you just have Welcome Home come in, and that song just hammers you.
Yep.
And what's great is it's actually at heart a simple song for Coheed in structure.
Right.
It's even a longer track. It's a little over 6 minutes, but you have this just absolutely killer metal guitar riff, and then you have the big strings come in. I mean, it feels like the big metal punch that Coheed wanted on their second album, but just didn't quite have the production value and budget to do. And then they come swinging out of the gate with Welcome Home, and it just hits so incredibly hard.
This has to be their most popular and best-selling song of all time. Has to be.
And it's their most successful album, and I think Welcome Home is mostly the reason why.
Yeah, and personally, and we'll get to this more in a minute, but I don't feel like it's really from like a quality standpoint, both from a songwriting and a storyline perspective, probably not the most deserving of being the best-selling record, other than the fact that you had Welcome Home on it, which Welcome Home is a great song, and many critics before Tom and I have likened that song as a pure example of Coheed and Cambria's influence from Led Zeppelin.
Yeah,
it's a very Kashmir-esque track. If you mirror up Welcome Home in the song Led Zeppelin song Kashmir, obviously there's a lot of similarities between that song. But so many artists can make that claim that they have Kashmir-like esque tracks, right?
Right.
So nonetheless, Welcome Home is a wonderful track, even if you have heard it a million times already, because it was played on the radio so much in 2005 and 2006. And I think it also showed up in Rock Band. So I remember that being awesome in the late 2000s.
Fun song to play.
Yeah. Especially in the awesome solo, which when we saw Coheed live last weekend, Claudio Sanchez decided to play that solo, with the guitar behind his head.
Because he can.
Because he's Claudio Sanchez. As far as the story goes, this is the last piece of the Amory War storyline that had like an actual publication that went along with it. There was a graphic novel, which I think you can still find here and there in like used bookstores, that told the story of what was happening here. And I gotta say, I think it's important to dig into the story on this one, for the particular reason that it sets up the closing album of this story, which is No World for Tomorrow, which is their 2007 release. We'll talk musically in a bit. But in the story of this one, Claudio, the main character, the last surviving child of Coheed and Cambria, has accepted his fate, that he is determined that it's up to him to stop the bad guy and save the galaxy. Like, essentially, he is tasked with this, and he is the chosen one of the crowing. And so as he goes through this in his quest to defeat his arch nemesis, he's also somehow interplaying with like his, and I'm saying this with air quotes, his god. But there's this narrator character called the writer, whose name is Claudio, and Claudio lives in New York and has just gone through a bad breakup and is really depressed, and so he has this bike that he's talking to called 10 Speed, but 10 Speed is an actual character in the story. And at the very end of this story, the writer actually goes through the mirror, which is the Willing Well, and there's a number of tracks at the end, which we'll talk about more in a minute, that are called the Willing Well. So he goes through this mirror and enters the story himself. So the writer becomes part of his own story, is determined he has to kill one of his characters that he had written because it reminded him too much of a girl that he was trying to get over in the real world, which is a significant character in Claudio the character's world. As you can tell, this is absolutely insane.
I don't know what you just said.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane. And I think that what it shows is that Claudio Sanchez is writing about his own writer's block. He actually created a story, and this is going to go kind of against what I said, and all the things. We've been just like spewing praise for this band.
Yeah.
And here's going to be like my first real criticism of Coheed and Cambria, and there's going to be a number of others that I want to point out later in summary. But especially in the early days, they were just doing everything right. That you didn't get to start seeing some of the cracks in their facade until a little bit later. And even though I love this band, I feel obligated to point out the parts and aspects of their music that I think show that they're not perfect,
Yeah.
And I think that that's very important, because there really is no perfect band.
So I think you've given me license now to jump in and be the negative Nancy here.
Because it's all you, buddy.
Because while I'm still not quite sure where I fall on their new one, their new album, Color Before the Sun, the rest of their albums before that, of those 7 albums, this album is easily my least favorite.
Okay.
And the reason is I feel like this is the one spot in their discography where they are guilty of sacrificing the musical quality for the sake of the story. It sucks because this album has 3 or 4 of my absolute favorite Coheed songs. Like, if I was making a top 10 Coheed songs list, I would pull 3 or 4 of those top 10 tracks from this album. And those songs are Welcome Home, 10 Speed, Apollo 1, The Writing Writer, and
The Writing Writer.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
And The Suffering.
Yeah.
Those 4 tracks are freaking awesome. In particular, The Writing Writer, that's probably my favorite song on here. I cannot get enough of that track.
I also think Mother May I is exceptional as well.
And see, for me, the rest of the tracks just fall flat, and that includes a couple that you like. I know you really like Once Upon Your Dead Body and Mother May I. I'm not big on those. In particular, I think Crossing the Frame is just a forgettable track, especially coming between Tin Speed and The Writing Writer. It just feels very flat. There's not much intensity to it. I just don't get much commitment. Wake Up is okay. I don't like The Lying Lies and Dirty Secrets of Miss Erica Court all that much. I just feel like a lot of those songs, it kills the flow of the album for me, and I just feel like I'm being lulled to sleep in those moments. So for me, this album has really tremendous high points, and then just like Mariana's Trench low points, where I care as little as I possibly could.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I have a different effect. You know, like you pointed out, like I like a couple of the tracks that just don't do anything for you. I like those tracks a lot. So I naturally like more of the tracks on this record, plus the tracks that aren't nearly as strong. And I will admit, like, we're in comparison, their first 2 records, every single track, I would say that every single track is fantastic.
Sure.
On this record, some of them are just less fantastic than the highlights. So you're starting to get into an area where there's arguably some disparity in track quality here. There's also, you know, the potential that there might just be filler, and I think what Tom would argue from what I'm hearing is that there are some filler tracks here.
Yes, I would say
so.
so.
Now, I personally don't think that it goes that far. I actually like most of the songs on this album, but there are definitely clear highlights. I would concede that. Now, I think that in talking about the structure of this record, you know, again, you know, whereas in Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3 was an hour and 9 minutes long, this is an hour and 11, almost an hour and 12 minutes long. It's a very long record. The reason why this record is so long is that the last 4 tracks on this record are The Willing Well parts 1 through 4. And they're each over 7 minutes long. So you have the last half an hour of this record. Essentially, they added an EP, a prog rock EP, onto the end of this third album.
And you basically summed up my thoughts right there, Jake, because these last 4 tracks, while I think they're pretty good on their own and explore some cool ideas, the very nature of them and the way in which they succeed is completely in contrast to the rest of the album.
Right.
Where I think that this album succeeds in the tracks that I already mentioned I really like is because of the strong hooks and the memorable instrumentals. What I think that we have in these last 4 tracks, I don't get much in the sense of hooks. They're more just sprawling prog tracks in the very prog traditional sense of the word, is that you don't really get much of like the pop melody. You get more intrigue from the instrumentation and where the song goes.
Yep.
You also have in the third installment of the Willing Well 3 Apollo 2, which is like the sequel to Apollo 1, The Writing Writer, that I mentioned I liked from earlier, but a significant amount of that track feels like a restatement of the first Apollo song on the album. They don't really do much different with that piece of it. They move on to something new later, but this is another part where they're repeating themselves in a way that I don't think really adds to the experience. I actually think that these last 4 tracks for me really disrupt the experience, and when you have these 4 tracks that occupy over 40% of the album's runtime, it feels like they're unevenly weighted, and I actually think I would have preferred it if they had made like the Willing Well EP and cut it off at that point, you know, for the sake of the story, maybe had it be a separate thing. And I know I'm probably in the minority on that, because I know a lot of people, and Coheed fans especially, really love this album, but I've just always struggled with it for that reason.
Yeah, that's. I really can't argue with any of that, other than that I just generally like this album. I think a significant amount more than you do. And the reason that I would say that's true is because of the instrumentation on this record.
Yeah, it's sharp. It's really well done. It really is.
And it's enhanced by the fact that the production is just an order of magnitude better than on the previous 2 records. On the two previous records, the guitars, I mentioned before, were working their asses off and adding a ton of the rhythm and the melody and the intensity to the songs and the album, therefore the album. On Good Apollo on Burning Star 4 Volume 1, you have an additional element starting to come out in the music, and that is the bass. And I think that what steals the show on this record is the bass. It is like the bass riffs in every track on this record are so absolutely mind-melting intense that it just adds this whole nother layer of complexity. Now, it also makes the music significantly more difficult to access. I mean, to just be able to put on, whereas the first two albums had that pop element to that. They've really drained this record of any pop elements. This is a very heavy record. This is like this is metal. I mean, this is prog metal. That's what I would describe this as. And every single track seems to exemplify that. Even the vocals are much more intense on this one, just blatantly screaming on some of the tracks, which they've done like a little bit of droplets of that here and there. But it's mostly been around Sanchez's just very high-pitched melodic vocals, whereas here they're getting a lot more of that grit coming out, and it's matching the intensity of and just the visceralness of all of these tracks, and the bass is driving and riffing and doing all these crazy things that it's hard for your brain to comprehend, and the guitars are following suit. And I really like the intensity that this album provides because of that, and I think that is what I really attach to a lot more. Plus, just like something like the first three tracks on this album are genius. And if you want to make an argument, Tom, about how like a single track can be great, can be good, but like the tracks around it will make it great, I would show you the first three tracks of Good Apollo. Keeping the Blade, especially Always and Never, and then Welcome Home, those three tracks right in a row, just capitalize on one another so much. Yeah,
this album starts so strong. Those first four tracks, I have absolutely no complaints about. It is solid.
And when you juxtapose that with the other bookend of this album being the Willingwell half an hour, like it doesn't balance out. It doesn't make sense. And so I can see why anyone would really struggle with this record.
Yeah, and I still do, even after I've listened to this album a crap load of times, because I always come back to it like, is it going to be this time that it really clicks with me? And it just still never happens. And I'll probably still keep coming back to it because those handful of songs, man, I can't, every now and then, I just can't get them out of my head.
A little over 2 years after Good Apollo was released, its follow-up, and I wouldn't call these a double album. They're definitely issued in two different times and have two different sounds. But the follow-up, Good Apollo on Burning Star 4, Volume 2, No World for Tomorrow, or for our intents and purposes, we'll just call it No World for Tomorrow, is released in October of 2007. No World for Tomorrow is the end of Claudio, the character's story. And we presume that what happens in the story is that Claudio enters Heaven's Fence and is somehow destroys the galaxy and ends the realm of the bad guys. And by the way, like throughout all of this, I apologize for glossing over so many of the details of the story, but for the purpose of this podcast, I kind of have to. And just the fact that I don't know enough about it to really do it justice. I apologize for that as well. Now, what I will say about the story here is that nothing was ever publicized that defines the story. Fans are still waiting. I've looked all over for what happens in No World for Tomorrow and the events of this album, and you just can't find anything on it. It's all just assumptions and like fan comments on like what happens in No World for Tomorrow. No one really knows. That's the problem. No one really knows. And if you remember what I was saying about the story of Good Apollo, you had the whole writer aspect of the storyline that I think is indicative of writer's block. And then you have this record where Claudio Sanchez didn't even make any written material to go along with the story to explain what was going on with this complete story. So you've set up this whole other universe where there's this epic storyline that spans this, and all these subplots that span multiple albums. And you get to the last one and you don't finish it? What the hell? What the hell? Seriously, like I don't know how like how people aren't more upset about this. I'm upset about this. I want the end of the story. Just complete it, right? And if maybe I missed something, if maybe in all my hours of reading up on Coheed and my just goo-goo-ness for this band over the past 4 years has like I've just missed the fact that this exists, I want you guys to tell me. I want you guys to let me know. Give me a good resource. Link it to me in a comment, in an email, in a Facebook message, whatever you want to do. Link it to me because I desperately want to know how this story ends, and I just can't find anything on it.
So jumping into the music, Jake, I actually think that the story or lack thereof on this album is actually key in shaping the music as well, because I think what we saw on Good Apollo and Burning Star 4 Volume 1 is that the story really shaped the way they had to do the music. That's why we get those sprawling Willing Well tracks at the end. That's why the album is connected the way that it is. And I think not really having that huge story driving No World for Tomorrow makes it much more a track-by-track album. Even when you get to the last 5 tracks that are indicated with Roman numerals in some kind of implication that there is a running theme between those tracks, which really, I mean, if you're telling a story through the whole album, I don't really know what makes those 5 tracks any different. Right. So it all seems kind of arbitrary to me.
The 5-part end.
Right, the 5-part end. I mean, why didn't they just have the whole album be that? I don't know. But where I think No World for Tomorrow, this is another one that I think we're going to be pretty separate on, but in the exact opposite way as the previous one we talked about, because this is actually my second favorite Coheed album, next to Second Stage Turbine Blade. And a lot of the reason is because Coheed, for me as a band, they're a band that I love the unique qualities of. I love the sound of. There's absolutely no one else like them out there. But they tend to come out with these like hour-long plus albums that I rarely feel are entirely justified. Mm-hmm. And No World for Tomorrow, for me, is one of their most consistent albums in track-by-track quality. It's where we see the production value is still stepped up from their first couple albums. I actually think the production value is a step down from Good Apollo Volume 1.
I would agree with that.
And also, then going into Year the Black Rainbow after this, the production goes back up. So I would almost love to see, this album with the production quality of the 2 albums around it. But when it comes to the songwriting, I just feel like they're really settling into a good spot here. They have some of the more metal tracks like The Hound of Blood and Rank, Gravemakers and Gunslingers. Love those couple of tracks. But then the title track 2, No World for Tomorrow, is one of my favorite Coheed songs. Other than that one, though, I don't actually feel like this album has a lot of like standout highlights. I don't think there's any one track that really brings me back. But for me, the whole experience is one of the most consistent ones that I get in the Coheed discography. There's nothing that I want to skip, and I feel like the album has good pacing and moves along with the right flow to just keep me engaged all the time. Even if it's not like there's not a lot of moments that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is blowing my mind. It's more just I put it on and I know that I'm just going to like it from start to finish.
Where Good Apollo Part 1 was a prog metal record, and you had all these really almost mathy, guitar and bass parts
for sure
driving or providing that instrumental foundation. On No World for Tomorrow, I think that the main difference is you get a lot of guitar crunches going on in most of the songs. This, for whatever reason, takes a lot of that moving complexity out of the guitar parts.
Sure.
And has a lot more of just like chords being strummed over and over again. It almost adds like a sludge element.
It's a much more straight rock album.
It really is. It really is. And I think that that's the thing that maybe turns me off the most about this record.
Sure.
Because even with that, the quality of the hooks and the melodies that typically came out in the guitars, which aren't coming out in the guitars anymore because what's been replaced by that is just this like devastating sound, rock sound. which admittedly fits the end of the record or
Yeah.
fits the end of the storyline. It just doesn't play out to be as inaccessible of a listen. There's not as much for me to relate to here. Plus the fact that I don't know what's going on in the story and I'm only just making assumptions, almost like it almost like takes away a bit of the warmth for me.
That makes sense. And I think that you actually indicated there something about the production that holds it back in a way that's bigger than just the production itself. It actually kind of goes against some of the prog leanings of their sound, because I think on No World for Tomorrow, part of the production issue is that things don't really stick out enough because they all join together in the mid-range, it seems like. On Good Apollo Volume 1, what you had was a really good just isolation of the frequency ranges. The bass was really nice and low. The kick drum thumped. Every place had its part on the frequency range. I feel like on No World for Tomorrow, nothing is really able to stick out as well. And so because of that, it sounds a little bit muddled. And I think that's what, maybe makes it sound like more just kind of a straight rock record, because it feels almost like it has that more live feel rather than kind of a studio polish to it with a lot of extras. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of that aspect of it. I just really like the songwriting, but I think that that really pulls it back from feeling as full and as punchy as their previous album.
Yeah, and that there, Tom, is the primary reason why I would say of the first 4 records, which really make up the original bulk or the main parts of the Amory Wars storyline, this is my least favorite.
Sure.
Of those 4, and it's also the album I'm least familiar with too. I mean, I've listened to it, whenever I'm going through a binge on Coheed, which happens about once a year.
Yeah.
I always listen to this record as part of that binge, but it's never really been one of those where I've gotten that feeling that I want to put it on and listen to again and again, like I have with every single other Coheed record. This to me is borderline my least favorite Coheed record, and maybe that'll change. I'm not trying to say there aren't enough terrible qualities to point out about this record.
Right.
It's more just the absence of really great qualities.
Just underwhelming, not offensively bad, but maybe just kind of underwhelming.
Precisely. And for a band like Coheed, that sticks out.
Yeah,
that sticks out because so many of their albums are so good and just have all these gems in them.
You know what they're capable of,
right,
and there are other options where you can get that same fulfillment, that same experience, but better.
Right.
So now moving forward to April of 2010, we're going about 2.5 years later, which by this point in these guys' careers was actually a fairly significant gap between releases. They seem to be releasing pretty regularly, especially considering they had a lot of content on their albums.
Right.
So we're at Year of the Black Rainbow now, 2010, and by this point, Jake, you and I had just started doing album reviews. We actually did this one as an early album review of
Interesting
ours.
story, Tom. Mm-hmm. Year of the Black Rainbow was the first Coheed I had ever heard, besides Welcome Home and listening through that. But I listened to back in my when I was in college in the mid 2000s and late 2000s, I had some coworkers who were really big Coheed fans, and one of them in particular had me listen. I would open up the store at Pizza Hut in the morning, and he would always play in Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth, and I never got into it then, but I remember when I go back and listen to it, I remember listening to that, and so many of the tracks stuck out to me. Same thing with Good Apollo Volume 1.
Sure. So there's two things that really make Year of the Black Rainbow stick out to me.
Well, first of all, what part of the story does this tell?
Good point. Let's address that first. So this is actually the prequel. This comes before Second Stage Turbine Blade. So that first part of the story that we were talking about, we're kind of missing, since we go, we start with part 2, then part 3, then Part 4, Part 1, and Part 4, Part 2 with their first 4 albums. Now we're jumping back to kind of the first steps of the Amory Wars before all the stuff with Coheed and Cambria actually happen in the first installment of their albums.
Right. And so story-wise, this tells the story of how Coheed and Cambria were created. Like I said when we were covering the Second Stage Turbine Blade, these are creatures that are part human, part iRobot, right? So this talks about how they were actually created and how the story came to be. And there's a very complicated story about that essentially this sets up everything that happens in the following albums.
So now jumping back to the music on Year of the Black Rainbow, there's two identifying factors that I think really set it apart from their other records. To begin with, though, we have to go back actually a couple of years and remember that sometime in, it looks like around late 2006, Josh Eppard, their drummer, who had been with them since before the recording of Second Stage Turbine Blade, actually left the band. So No World for Tomorrow and Year of the Black Rainbow actually had a different drummer, and that was Chris Penny. And I feel like on No World for Tomorrow, the new drummer, it doesn't play as big of a role. Like, I mean, he does a fine job, but it's not really all that noticeable. On Year of the Black Rainbow, it is noticeable.
Right.
The drums are crazy, and crazy in a way that none of the first three albums with Josh Eppard you really noticed, especially when you get to track 3, Guns of Summer. Oh my gosh, when that song kicks in, the drums are going nuts along with the guitar, and it's a kind of metal side of Coheed and Cambria that you never really even noticed before. And there's a lot of that throughout this album, even before you get to Guns of Summer, the track 2, The Broken, while the drums aren't going quite as crazy, it's a heaviness and an intensity, especially in Claudio's vocal performance, that you get hints of on their other albums, but I feel like is even much more aggressive on this one. The second aspect that really sets this one apart is Atticus Ross's production. The production on this album is unlike anything that had come before it. Atticus Ross, if you're familiar with him, he was known for working a lot with Nine Inch Nails. After this, he would form How to Destroy Angels with Trent Reznor. So it's a very sharp, very industrial leaned production sound, and you get that on here all over the place. This album, though, in terms of songwriting, is once again a little bit more straight rock. You don't have the sprawling tracks. You don't have anything on here that comes close to the title track from In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth or Light in the Glass or 2113 or the Willingwell tracks. It's a little more track by track, but I love the sheen that this album has on it. That production sheen is so sharp, and in a lot of ways, I think that it actually helps to complement the sci-fi edge that's there in the storytelling.
They certainly simplified the sound on Year of the Black Rainbow.
Yes.
The songs, as you mentioned, aren't as long, but that doesn't mean that they work any less crazy intense, right? Like the guitars are absolutely overwhelming. And I would say the guitars on Year of the Black Rainbow work harder than on any other Coheed album. And that's saying something, because if you go back and listen to Good Apollo Part 1, like the guitars are crazy on that album from a technical perspective. On this album, you have so many layers of guitar. The production is so deep and so intricate on this record, and that's what gives it that sheen that Tom was discussing just a moment ago. In addition, they've almost kicked back and they're really following more of a pop structure. And on the surface, you could listen to these songs and go, oh, well, it's verse, chorus. Why does Jake like this album at all? Because I typically hate albums that do that a lot. And I would say that this album does do that a lot. They simplified the structure down a lot. For Coheed and Cambria are able to get away with this because of all the other complexity that they have in their music. A little bit of simplicity goes a long way. It really makes the songs more accessible. I personally think this is the most underrated Coheed album of their discography. And in what exemplifies this is the fact that they didn't play any tracks from this at
I was
our
hoping
concert.
you'd say that, because I noticed that too.
Yeah, and that I think is unfortunate. If you look at tracks 1 through 5 on this album, 1, The Broken Guns of Summer, the awesome Here We Are Juggernaut,
Great
which is
song.
one of my favorite Coheed songs, and then the more melodic, almost ballad, but still rocking track Far. Those tracks, I mean, what a genius first half of a record. Like I'm getting chills just thinking about it. Like this record is very well written. My one criticism of this record is that the back half doesn't withstand, doesn't meet the quality of the front half. And
I would agree with that. I still think there's some good tracks
There
there.
absolutely are.
I in particularly like Made Out of Nothing, All That I Am. It's a little bit of a poppier track, almost feels like kind of a power ballad, but once again, Claudio holds it together with his terrific vocal melody. I like When Skeletons Live pretty well, and the Black Rainbow, if you could call it title track, closing track, 7.5 minutes long, is where you get a little bit more prog in the song structure, and that one especially with some like the vocal filters that they're using. Once again, Atticus Ross producing it. That one feels a little bit more like Nine Inch Nails.
it has an industrial edge to it.
Sure
It's one of my favorite songs on this album for sure. I think this record is great, just straight through. I think the story is very complete, and I believe there was like some graphic novel that was released with this one, so it is a very, very complete and well thought out story that perfectly sets up the Amory War story of the second stage Turbine Blade through No World for Tomorrow. So it's a nice addition there. It's just very well done, top to bottom, and that's something that I think just people underappreciate. This is the last album that takes place in the context of the Amory War story, of Coheed and Cambria's story, and it's a nice way to kind of tie a bow on the storyline too. So I was really pleased with this record when it came out, and going back and listening to it over the years, and then in preparation for this podcast, I love this record, and I don't understand why it doesn't get more clout.
Yeah, I agree. I think part of the reason is that it just sticks out in their discography as being really drastically different. It doesn't quite flow with their kind of timeline. I almost think it would make more sense going from No World for Tomorrow to the Afterman albums without that album in there. Not to say that it's bad, but just it's a weird kind of, to me, I see it as like a sidestep. Not in quality, but just in terms of presentation consistency.
And interesting enough, Claudio Sanchez had actually planned on doing Year of the Black Rainbow as the prequel. He referred to it as the prequel from the very beginning of his whole venture into this world he created. And so the fact that he was able to come back and do it so well, I think is worth praise. So moving on, in October of 2012, you received part 1 of the Afterman double album, called Ascension. And then the following February 2013, Coheed and Cambria released the Afterman Dissension. So, Tom, you and I were heavy into our album reviews on our YouTube channel at the time. And I remember when this came out, I remember us really being excited for Ascension, and then being a little bit let down. I mean, we gave it, we liked it, but we gave it low 80s for a score. And then when Dissension came out, we both really liked Dissension. But the thing that I noted was how it almost didn't make sense why Coheed and Cambria released this as a double album, but released the first half, essentially 100 and some odd days in advance of the second half, Dissension. And when you put these two records together, it tells a complete story about Cyrus Amory, and really how the whole Amory War story, it's kind of like the legend that the whole kind of galaxy that they live in was based around, right? And I honestly, I can't do the story justice. A graphic novel was released for this, and it gets pretty detailed, and Cyrus Amory goes on this quest, and he's discovers the keywork and the energy of the universe and what that means, and it has all this implications on what he has to do on this quest to do that, and he meets all these different characters on this quest. It's honestly a very Dante-like story, right? And I find that to be very, very intriguing, and adds a lot of color to a lot of these songs. So story aside, how would you describe the music of the Afterman albums, Tom?
The music on the Afterman albums, and this is a quality that I really like about them, I feel like it's really tightened up. Whereas you had some more sprawling tracks on their first 3 albums, you still get some longer tracks on here, but they feel more like just kind of your standard rock track still. But the thing that I like about Afterman, Ascension, and Descension is that they tighten up the sound, but still between tracks, you still get a very dynamic experience.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of variety within the sound. The production has remained sharp. It still feels very sci-fi-like because there are a lot of electronic elements and little flares that they're throwing into the sound. But from track to track, I feel like they do a better job on these 2 albums than they did on No World for Tomorrow or Year of the Black Rainbow, of accomplishing between tracks the variety that they used to get within the same 9-minute track on any of their first few records, if that makes sense.
What I love about the Afterman albums, as far as Coheed and Cambria's sound, is to me, this is the album where they perfect their sound. Earlier I spoke of, their original sound, and it was very guitar heavy, and Tom was talking about how it, referenced post-hardcore, but it was always more proggy than that, and then they really took that up a notch on In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth. But then when they went to their major label on Columbia and released the first Good Apollo installment, they really shifted towards this prog sound. And then No World for Tomorrow was more metal. Then Year of the Black Rainbow, they switched producers, and it had this more industrial sheen, but yet was more simply structured. My point of bringing all this back up, and not only to summarize what we've been talking about all this time, but also to show that like Coheed and Cambria are constantly evolving their sound. While these guys are in a particular niche genre that they're defining for themselves, they're still pushing their sound. They're still trying to do new things on each album. When you get to the Afterman, you get the best of all those parts.
I completely agree.
You get the best of all those parts. You get a little bit of emo, a little bit of post-hardcore here, and a little bit of that immaturity of the post-hardcore, that the natural immaturity that maybe that's the wrong word, or juvenileness of the post-hardcore sound. You get the prog elements. You get the metal elements here. It's kind of all in balance. Everything is very polished sounding, and a lot of that's due to the production, but also the songwriting and how they chose to really structure this and only put things. Every single sound you hear on the Afterman records was designed so that you would hear that exact sound at that exact moment. There are no accidents on this record.
But not only do they package it together in a way sound-wise that I think really pulls all the good qualities of the 5 albums that came before it, but I also think they have the tact to tighten it up in terms of time. And this is actually a spot where I feel like it was a good move to split up Afterman, Ascension, and Descension, because even though you can think of them as kind of 2 sides of a double album, for me, it makes it much more consumable. It makes it much easier to get through and digest when it's in 2, 35 to 40 minutes pieces, rather than a huge 70-minute piece. I feel like if they had just mashed them together and not tried to put any separation there, which actually I think I would have been fine if they had presented this as one double album. What I wouldn't have liked is if they'd smashed it together as just the Afterman and there was no separation. I don't think that would have been good. That's what I feel like they did with the Willingwell tracks at the end of Good Apollo Volume 1. So I actually love that they had the tact to split this up, because then to me,
it gives dotted line.
It does. It gives me a breaking point in the listening experience to where I can kind of take a breather, reflect on what I've listened to, and move forward.
And brilliantly, it fits right in the story too. Not to get too into it, but as he's entering the key work, like that's where the Ascension ends, and Descension is him getting out and trying to recover and coming home.
Thematically, you also get some kind of tie-ins between each one, but then also they're allowed to be separated with those key entity extraction tracks. And I love the way that they structured this, because there are 4 key entity extraction tracks on the Afterman Ascension,
and
then there's only one on Descension.
Right.
So it ties it together, but allows them to have their own kind of identity, because Ascension is more heavily weighted with the key entity extraction tracks, and all 4 of those tracks are just killer.
Yep.
They're just wonderful. But then when you get to Descension, I think that the one entity extraction track, Century the Defiant, is easily the best song on that album. It is tremendous.
And I actually think it's the best of the key entity extraction tracks. There's a number of great songs on Dissension that I really think help balance it out, because at that part of the story, you know, Cyrus has already gone back to his home world, and so he's now dealing with you know, reassimilating to his world after being on this like gigantic quest, kind of like Frodo after he gets back from Mordor, right?
Yeah.
It's just, you know, a wholly different world. And so it kind of tells a different story, but it's still part of the overarching theme of the Afterman. And just throughout this record, what I like about it is that they show through their songwriting all of the different places that they have been from a songwriting and musicianship standpoint. And this really does just a great job of tying up everything. Now, going forward, this is the last record that takes place in that universe that Claudio Sanchez created. And this is a really nice way to end it. I think that this finishes the story off. Now, I've always wondered, and before we get to The Color Before the Sun, before we get to that record, you know, I wonder if like he's ever going to go back to that. But
Yeah.
as I mentioned earlier, like he clearly, I think, was going through some writer's block at a certain period of time. He had the storyline of the Year of the Black Rainbow kind of predefined from the beginning, or at least in his head. So that was he was able to do that. And then this is a whole separate story, still in the same universe, right?
Right.
But outside of that, like, where do you go from here? And I think that what's interesting is trying to explore, trying to empathize with Claudio Sanchez, the songwriter, and the visionary musician that he is, and trying to empathize with him and understand like where he was probably at when writing all this. You know, if I were him, I wouldn't have an answer for where are you going to go from here.
No,
you've done it all,
and I think it's futile to try to plan ahead too much. And I really do understand where he's coming from as an artist with that, because moving into The Color Before the Sun, the thing about it, like I can see where, as an artist, you have to get out of your own head.
Right.
And there is an insane amount of value in just breaking free from, you know, your previous way of doing things and taking a fresh approach. And I actually thought it was neat when I heard that Color Before the Sun would be their first album that's not a concept album that takes place in this universe that he had created. Because to me, I was like, yeah, my bro Claudio is breaking his chains and you know, trying to move forward in a different direction, make it more about the music than the themes. And, you know, whether it actually yielded better music is to be determined. I don't think that Color Before the Sun is one of their stronger albums, but I don't think it's a bad album. And especially if it's Claudio's breath of fresh air to get out of you know, the singular way of doing things that he had been doing for, you know, nearly 15 years, then I think it's a pretty damn good album, considering that's a huge adjustment for an artist to make when you've been in one mindset for so long.
Right. Produce
7 albums under that same way of thinking, to all of a sudden break free from that is a huge adjustment. I think that you know, not being him, but still trying to you know, empathize or at least sympathize with the artist mindset, I think that's really important to take into account.
So, summing this up, at the beginning of the podcast, we mentioned that The Color Before the Sun, that's Coheed and Cambria's 8th studio record, came out in October of 2015. When this album came out, Tom, we covered it in our monthly wrap-up for October 2015 on this podcast. And I remember when listening to this album, I listened to it twice before we did that. And like we've said in other podcasts, when we're doing these monthly wrap-ups, we're not doing the detailed listens that we used to do back in album reviews, where we'd listen to it like 5+ times. You can get it like maybe one, or if it's a good record that we like, probably 2 listens in, and that's about all we have time for, to be honest with you, with all the other stuff that we're trying to do. And then the albums that really rise to the top will stick with us throughout the year. Well, this album was on the borderline of rising to the top and sticking with us. You know, I've listened to this a few times up to seeing them live last weekend, and I gotta say, like, seeing them live completely changed my mind about this album. I originally, somewhere in my mind I was like, well, this is probably just like an average album at best, and I remember thinking that, like, it's very much more pop structured. It's much simpler than any previous Coheed album. And a lot of the lyrics I didn't feel like stuck with me as much. Now, that's also within the context that I knew that this wasn't a concept album. But, you know, honestly, if you just look at the lyrics of The Color Before the Sun, if you didn't know that this wasn't part of the Amory War storyline, there's so many references to different planets and technology and things like that, that it would almost be hard not to think of it as part of that. Like, you could almost make it fit. That just shows how closely, you know, that whole storyline worked with Claudio's songwriting style.
Yeah, you know, what we have here is, once again, we have the traditional elements of Claudio's melodic writing in the vocals and in the guitar that are driving this album, and still, you know, we're doing so throughout their discography. What we're also seeing, though, is they're shedding some of the sci-fi elements of the sound that you heard on their previous 3 albums, Year of the Black Rainbow and the Afterman records. They're shedding some of that, like, sci-fi extravagance, because they also shed it from the actual lyrical content, right? So it makes sense for them to do that. This sounds like more of a straight rock album, and while it certainly isn't albumized from a conceptual standpoint, it still feels like it has a good flow to it. Sure. You have the track Ghost right in the middle of the album, which is a really good and also tactfully short kind of acoustic ballad. Right. You have the closing track, Peace to the Mountain, which I think is another good, just kind of stripped down, more emotional piece. But there are some rock highlights on here too. I love Island. I love Here to Mars. I loved Atlas. There are a couple songs I'm not quite as big on, like Young Love and The Audience. I wasn't too big on those, but overall, it's still a good album. And like I said, for trying to get into a different way of doing things, I think it's a step in the right direction, and I'd certainly be interested to hear what these guys are doing next.
Yeah, several of the tracks here, Tom, I really find highlight Claudio Sanchez's songwriting ability. It's interesting to see him out of the context of the Amory War storyline, starting to take almost a singer-songwriter approach to his songwriting. Like Here to Mars, he mentioned at the concert he wrote for his wife, and it's an incredibly romantic song. In fact, I keyed in on that when we listened to this last October, as just how romantic the lyrics are, and it resonated with me, right? Also, the track 6, Atlas, is named after his son, and really, I think, speaks volumes to just how he lets everyday subjects in his life affect his music in both his writing and his performance, because it was a very convicting performance. I thought Peace to the Mountain was just an absolute wonderful treat live. It's how they went into their encore, and I really thought that he just hit the nail on the head with this song. You know, a number of these tracks, while I said that they're more poppy, they still have that inherent Coheed and Cambria brand of being able to be more poppy, be more lighthearted, and there's more ballads on this record than on any other record, but still rock out and still hold a lot of elements of really good rock music that we've seen from many bands over the years. And Coheed has achieved such a huge amount of success over their versatility in rock music. And this album, The Color Before the Sun, I think does a good job of making that point. And I think that that's where I'm starting to really identify with this record more. And while it's never going to be one of my favorite Coheed and Cambria albums, in fact, it might not ever even top No World for Tomorrow, my least favorite Coheed and Cambria album prior to this coming out. While it might not ever even top that, I do think it speaks volumes for who Coheed and Cambria are as a band and as artists, and where they could potentially go from here.
Yeah.
Now, where does Coheed and Cambria go from here? A band that's done it all. They've done post-hardcore, they've done emo, they've done metal, they've done prog, and then they've been able to solidify all of those genres into one album with the Afterman, and then now they're moving away from being that conceptual prog storyline. Where do they go from here?
I can tell you where I'd like to see them go.
Where would you like to see them go?
So I see The Color Before the Sun as being a first step in a new chapter for this band. And to me, what I think that could mean is this was Claudio cleansing his palate, so to speak, clearing his mind and getting ready to do something else. I would expect that their next album is going to be a little bit more ambitious. I think it's going to probably have a similar sound palette to this one, but I would bet that they get a little bit heavier, a little bit more ambitious, and just relearn how to do those things outside of the context of a concept album.
Right.
And I think that there's a lot of potential to do something great if that's the direction that they go in.
So, Tom, you mentioned earlier that your favorite Coheed and Cambria album is their first album, The Second Stage, Turbine Blade. Mine is their second album, In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3. What are your guys' favorite Coheed and Cambria albums? We want to know. Send us an email, write us a Facebook message, or reply on our YouTube channel to this video in a comment, and we would love to hear your responses. So, Tom.
Yeah.
Do you feel as if Coheed and Cambria deserve consideration to be considered one of the best rock acts of our era?
I think that depend on exactly where you draw that line of one of the best. For me, they're definitely one of the better rock bands of our era. I don't know if I would put them in my top 5. I don't know if I'd put them in my top 10. I'd have to think about it. But if we're looking like top 20, top 40, they would certainly be in there somewhere.
Yeah. Let's say the era is, 2000s
2000s on. Mm-hmm.
And if you do that, I can only think of like a few other bands that would rival these guys.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason why I would argue that they should be considered for that label is because of the incredible amount of thoughtfulness that goes into every single Coheed album.
They've accomplished an impressive amount.
Yep. The other thing that I got to say I love about this band that a lot of people and a lot of skeptics, a lot of Coheed critics are going to point out that I choose to ignore for good reason, is that Coheed are very imperfect.
Mm-hmm.
Really, there's no album, even outside of our two favorites, their first two albums, Tom, even outside of those records, they really don't have an album that's perfect.
Yeah,
they really don't. Like every aspect, every album has an aspect about it that's imperfect. The first two albums lacked in production, and occasionally there was some dead parts to a song here or there.
Right.
Some of the albums later on had filler tracks to it. There really isn't a perfect Coheed album. They're always long, and typically long albums, don't justify their length. And Coheed is certainly guilty of that at times. Certainly, they can be overindulgent, and a lot of times they can get a little campy. Like just throwing out a lot of criticisms that I would definitely say are true of Coheed's music, but they do everything so well. Every single Coheed album has some of the best rock and roll tracks I've heard in a long time on it. And it's those wins, the fact that they're willing to do it, that they stick themselves out there, it makes their downside, their imperfections more endearing to me. And I actually end up liking them more because they have those imperfections, because they're not the perfect band.
There are two big reasons to me that they are able to get around the criticisms you just spoke of, Jake. And I say this because I completely agree with you. They're not a perfect band. And I would say that they, for being such a good band, they still have a lot of weak spots in their albums. But the two things for me is, first off, you're not going to get this from any other band. You're not going to get the experience you get with Coheed and Cambria from listening to any other band. There's no one else like them. And that unique quality is hugely valuable to me. It's really what defines them, is that quality of their sound and their approach, more so than the actual quality of the stuff that they're writing. So there's that aspect of it, but also they're one of the few bands that can get away with having some, lesser quality tracks on albums that might make them lesser quality albums in the span of their career, that somehow I feel like you put their albums together and it makes a career that is better than the sum of its parts.
Completely agree with that.
And you don't get that with, I can't think of any other band. Like most bands, if they have an album that I don't like, then I consider it a knock against that band's entire value, entire worth of their catalog. With Coheed and Cambria, the thing is, even like I mentioned, probably one of my least favorites of theirs is Good Apollo Volume 1. Still, I don't feel like that album's actually a hit against their discography because it accomplishes stuff that none of their other albums do and that no other band I know of does. So kind of like how we've said within an album, you can have some lesser quality tracks on an album and still have it be good if they're contributing to the overall album. That's how Coheed is as a band. They can have some lesser quality albums, and as long as they're not retracing their steps or just putting out complete crap, it still adds to this huge body of work across 8 albums they've done to the point of recording this podcast, that I don't feel like they retrace their steps at all, and they keep it fresh within themselves and compared to other bands to make it justified.
I completely agree with that. We recently had an email come in from a Velocities in Music podcast listener asking about genre bias and how it affects the listening experience. Tom and I love this question and really want to take the time to dive into it. So we've decided we're going to dedicate our next podcast to it. So tune in next week to listen to our thoughts on that subject. Thank you guys for your continued support and participation with Velocities in Music. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, your Facebook messages and emails. Your participation is what makes Velocities in Music possible. So as always, thank you for being awesome. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.